that week, our daughter was born. So suddenly I was at home. My mum and dad were still in Port Elizabeth, and my husband was working very hard. And I remember my daughter was rather a screechy baby. She didn't sleep very well because she was also premature. And I decided that I'd write a book while she was sleeping. So it was a very short book, and it was written.
That was very brave as well.
In very small pieces, because whenever she went to sleep, I would start, and it was called Alu the Mouse Without Whiskers. In fact, I'd written it as an exercise when I was doing my degree, because I'd first written the story in very bad Xhosa. Anyway, I wrote it now in English, and because when I was at the museum, I had worked with a wonderful artist, Cora Coetzee, who has illustrated many children's books in Afrikaans. She did the illustrations for me, and that was one of the happiest collaborations of my life, because there was my very close friend and I doing this book together.
How wonderful.
So Nalu came out, and it was a success, and I was really thrilled, but suddenly kind of being able to say I was writing a book and it had really worked and been published. So while little Sue was small, and then I was pregnant again, I wrote a book called A Mantis in the Moon, which was, I think, the first book by which I sort of became known in any way. And I just wanted to tell you a story about how I got the title of the book. It was a very hot afternoon, and I had one more story to write, and I couldn't think of what to write. And Sue had just gone to sleep at last, and I should have been feeding the washing machine or doing something like that. But this huge mantis plopped down onto the table in front of me and sort of looked at me as if to say, well, here I am. And so I wrote, there was once a mantis who tried to catch the moon. And that was the title story of the book. And I remember correcting the galley proofs in Addington Hospital in the waiting room, sort of in labor, but then the labor stopped and the sister kept coming in and saying, well, in this very sort of cross voice, as if there's anything going, and I had to waddle out of the hospital again because the labor stopped. Anyway, the Mantis in the Moon and our second daughter was born more or less together. And I remember taking her on a plane to Johannesburg for the launch of the book, and one of my friends having to nurse this baby that needed a feed while the book was launched. And that book was illustrated by Lee Voigt, who obviously is a very well-known artist, who actually is my cousin. Our mums are sisters. And well, since then I did the children's books and very much busy, being a mum as well. But I decided then to do my PhD in Zulu. So my children were then I had already written a novel called Shades and one called Train to Doornbold. But I decided I needed to go back to the subject, which I really loved. And so I went back to university. And in fact, I was lectured again by the prof who had been my lecturer when I was an undergraduate, which was wonderful to reconnect again after almost 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And I was going to do my thesis on bird calls in Zulu, because Zulu, when a bird calls in Zulu, it is often echoed in they give an onomatopoeic interpretation of it. And it was going to be an incredibly difficult thesis because there are hundreds of birds, and it also meant fieldwork. And then one day, a friend of mine said, my dad would like to come and see you. And I said, what about? And he said, he's got something to show you. And this wonderful man called Bert Schroeder, who had been Inspector of Education in KZN, arrived at my door, and he had this huge packet of photographs, and he laid them out on the table, and he said, whatever you're doing, my girlie, you must stop right now, because this is the work that you have to do. And it was dozens of pictures of cattle. And I always thought I knew about nature and things like that. Everything I've ever written has been about animals or birds or whatever. But these, suddenly I realized that there were these wonderful Zulu cattle with color patterns that were interpreted in a metaphorical way by the people in order to identify them and classify them. So that you'd get a black and white cow with a white face and a black body called Ingwazi, the fish eagle, because a fish eagle, of course, has a white head and a black body. Or Abafazi Bawelimfula, the woman crossed the river, and it's a cow with a wavy pattern on it, say brown above and white below, as if she'd walked into rippling water and pulled up her skirts, and the water had lapped at her thighs. So that was the woman cross the river pattern. And these patterns, there were hundreds of them. They were absolutely fascinating. And this wonderful, wonderful man, who was in his 80s then, just said to me, I can't finish this work. I'm too old and I'm not well. And so he gave me his archive, which was field work that he'd done over years and years and years. And he was a wonderful linguist. But we spent about a year going around together to cattle auctions to do field work on the cattle. And I used to go to the holding pens at the auctions and talk to the herdsmen, you know, who were looking after the cattle or who owned the cattle, and pretend I didn't know anything at all, and then ask them about the names and the color patterns. So it was wonderful field work and just incredible sense of this love of cattle that these men had. Anyway, I did the thesis and I graduated, and I remembered that I had to take the thesis to Bert to give him a copy of it. And I traveled up to Escort where he lived, and he was in bed, he wasn't well. And I said, you know, I gave it to him, and he said, one day, my girlie, we're going to get up and go and see the little calves frolicking, because it's spring now and the calves will be born, and we'll go and see them together. And I knew that, and he knew as well, that it couldn't happen. And he died a few days later. And his son said to me, my dad said that you've got to come and talk at his funeral and tell all his relations why cows are important. And so I did. And I just remember when I was driving home, I was on a high road and I looked down and there was this land where cattle were grazing, and it was a herd of Ngunis. And this incredible ray of sunshine came out and just shone on them. And to me, it was Bert saying, thank you for telling them. It was just such a wonderfully warming and moving experience.
What a beautiful story.
That was my excursion into cattle. But of course, I was just so incredibly lucky because Lee Voigt is my cousin, and her paintings of animals, birds, trees were quite extraordinary. And so she said she would illustrate the book. And so the thesis was published, obviously cut down tremendously as a book, but mostly with the most important feature of it is her illustrations of all the different Nguni color patterns. And very fortunately, the whole collection of paintings were bought as one collection. And they're now in the library at Brenthurst in the Oppenheimer's home.
Oh, magical. That's
wonderful.
wonderful.
Shirley Oppenheimer is a great lover of Nguni cattle and owns many. And it's been it's wonderful to know it's there because, as she said, the whole herd must be kept together. And of course, it's open to the public to see, which means that it's not being dispersed all over the place to different buyers, but, you know, there it is as a legacy of these wonderful cattle.
Marguerite,
So,
can we go back one step to when you were chatting to the herdsmen about the cattle? What was their reaction to you when you could talk to them about their cattle in their own language?
I think a little intrigued also because, not just because I was white, but also because I was a woman, because women are not supposed to go near the cattle kraal at all. But I suppose they thought I was something of an oddity, but I've often had many wonderful reactions. For example, I was standing in a queue at Postnet and I had some color pictures with me that I wanted to have photocopied because, you know, it was to do with work on the book. And I was just standing there looking at them, and a man was standing behind me, and he looked over my shoulder and said something to himself, and I turned around and I pointed at the cow and gave the color pattern. Well, there was suddenly this explosion of conversation, of this unbelievable enthusiasm, and in a sense, kind of wonder and delight that somebody really took somebody without the culture, had taken some sort of interest in this. So there's always been a reaction of surprise and interest and delight. And for me, listening to herdsmen praise their cattle is also an incredibly intimate exchange between an animal and a person, which has been wonderful to witness. I wish my Zulu was better than it is. It's not great. It's academic. And I make apology for that because it should be better than it is. I started off with Xhosa and I make an incredible muddle of the two. But even now I've got some of Lee's pictures in my house, and if somebody comes in here who you know, who doesn't know me, for example, if somebody comes to do work on a light switch or something, I see a man stop and stare at this picture, and it always elicits a response of delight and astonishment in a way to find it there. And that's been, again, just such a lovely point of contact and conversation, and, you know, in-depth conversation about something that's really important in another culture.
There's a potter, and I think it's Nick Satorli, I stand to correction, who does Nguni cattle out of clay, and they are absolutely fantastic.
Yes, absolutely beautiful. I remember he did one for, I think it's in the monument in Grahamstown for Nelson Mandela.
Oh, is that so? I didn't know that.
Anyway, sorry, go on.
Eleanor, you've worked at Brenthurst. Have you seen that collection?
I have. I was there when it was opened, and it was just amazing, and it's still there, isn't it? This was quite a few years ago, and also the artifacts, the old milking pails and lovely bead sculptures and things like that. So that was the cattle work, and then I went back to. I mean, I'm really a novelist. So I wrote a book called Recessional for Grace after that, which was to do with writing the thesis about cattle and how one gets inspirations for work. And in fact, that book's my heart book, Recessional for Grace. But I also wrote a book called Iron Love, which was set in the First World War. And our roots have always been in the Eastern Cape, both Martin's and mine. And in 2003, I went back to Grahamstown to teach at St. Andrews, which was his old school, and also the school that my great-grandfather had been the chaplain at, and all my relations had been at. So we'd had connection with the school since its start in Grahamstown in 1855. And I was asked to do the history of the school. And because we wanted to go home, it was a way to have a job there and be able to do that. Our children had both gone to university then and starting to make their own lives. And so I was in Grahamstown for that year, and we had bought a little townhouse there. And I taught first year boys, 13-year-olds, which was a very challenging and wonderful experience. And while I was doing that, I had to start doing research into the history of the school. And it was, I think it was the most difficult thing I've ever done. It was more difficult than the cattle thesis, also because I had to write about rugby and cricket. And I won't tell you what my husband's comments are about my abilities in that line.
Nothing like a bit of familiar.
But I had to jack up in no uncertain terms. And that book took me 5 years. But in doing that, it led me into research about the early education of Black people and missions, because St. Andrews, in fact, had a mission branch. It had a college attached to it for Black students. And that led me into the story that I've just written, not Recessional for Grace, A Sin of Omission. Anyway, gosh, I am talking far too much. But
no, it's fabulous. I don't have to say a word. It's wonderful.
Okay. While I was down there, I decided to write a book about a lighthouse, which is called The Keeper, because I'd always been intrigued by the lighthouse in Bird Island or Port Elizabeth, where we lived when I was little. So that was a kind of excursion after I'd finished the St. Andrews history, into something completely different, from having to work in archives and make footnotes and be absolutely sure you had the right page number and all that kind of thing. And then I wrote a book which I just enjoyed so much, which is called Taken Captive by Birds. I don't know if you know this book, Mandi.
I don't.
It was, let me just get a picture, one of the pictures. I met this wonderful young artist called Craig Ivor. And he does, these are pencil sketches. Oh dear, of course, just because I need to find a page, I can't. He does pencil sketches of birds. That, for example, is a crow.
Oh.
But I wrote it was almost a memoir. It's called Taken Captive by Birds, about birds somehow being symbolic of certain parts of your life, or somehow being there at certain parts of your life. And so I wrote about 12 different birds, and each reflected some part of childhood. The robin, the wagtail, the dukop, the crow, which was a very dark moment, and the nightjar, which is my favorite bird of all. And working with this young artist who really is extraordinarily talented, Craig Ivor, led to this book. And it was just such a happy experience, because also it was a rediscovery of childhood and things that happened in my life, particularly my parents. My mother was the most wonderfully caring person, and she took the most enormous care of the people around her, particularly very poor people on the small holdings and in the farming community where we lived. And it was she who encouraged me a great deal to do Xhosa and anthropology as well. She'd been a member of Black Sash since it started, and human rights and things like that were really important to her. So a lot of this book, in a way, is a tribute to my mum, because I always remember when she said to me that if she died, she would love to be a seagull. So I ended the book, and she never saw the book, unfortunately, writing about the seagull. And then when I had done that, then I wrote the Lighthouse book, in fact. But I just launched the Lighthouse book, and we decided we were invited, I was invited to talk at an old Andrian dinner in England. And we went on a trip to the battlefields in France to commemorate the old Andrians who had died in the First World War. And also because I had written a book about Andrians in the First World War called Iron Love. And it was a wonderful experience again, finding the soldiers that had been so important to me in my story, and that I had found in a photograph album of a relation, a young chap called Charlie Fraser. And I followed up the history of all his friends and wrote a book about that. And then we went to find some of the graves. And it was a very moving experience going to Delville Wood with old Andrians who had relations who had fought there, or who had died in the First World War. But when I came back, I was ready to start on writing A Sin of Omission, which went back right to my childhood, when my great uncle, who I was very fond of and loved dearly, and who was an incredible Xhosa speaker, had been brought up on St. Matthew's Mission, and he told me a story which became the book. But before I go on to that, when I came back from France, I wasn't well, and very shortly after that, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer.
Oh wow! Know that.
It was in the bowel and had gone to the nodes in my lungs, and they said more or less go home and be happy. But my daughter said to me, "You're not doing anything of the sort. You've got to be here for your grandchildren." So I went through a year of really very severely hectic chemo, and I wasn't with it at all. In fact, I read in an incredible number of books. I kept saying to myself, right, now's the time to be really educated. I look at those books and I can't remember a word I read. I can't even remember the titles. I just know that I was very diligent about it. And while I was always tied up to the chemo tree, I used to try and make plot notes for this book that I wanted to write so badly, and that I had in fact started writing. And I felt that I was never going to get to the end of it. And that, it just wasn't going to happen. But I have to say that I was cared for by an absolutely magnificent husband and 2 magnificent daughters and their husbands and 4 little grandchildren, which made life completely bearable. And even though I was a wacky old lady, I remember being hauled off to hospital because I got pneumonia, and my little granddaughter of 3 brought me her favorite blankie, which she never went to sleep without, so that it would keep me safe. And it did. And in December 2015, I went into remission, and I'm still there. They didn't expect it. It's nearly 5 years later.
That's fantastic.
And so I thought, well, now you've got to get on with it. And so I really got stuck into writing A Sin of Omission. And I fortunately had a wonderful friend who lived in England who got me all the research that I needed from Oxford of the United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which were all the missionary letters from the Eastern Cape at the time I was writing about. And those were an extraordinary source of information, as well as the Corey Library in Grahamstown, because we went back to Grahamstown. And so it was a very hard struggle, and it took me from then until the book was published last year in 2019 in October. And since then, it has just been sort of one coincidence after the other of meeting people and having responses from people that have either worked in that environment or whatever, that has been deeply, wonderfully gratifying. And so to have made a journey which was really very hard and I nearly gave up on was in every way, completely and utterly worthwhile.
Speaking of a
And
Sin
so
of
here I am.
Thank you. And here you are, and it's Sunday morning, and we are about to bash the Anglican Church. A Sin of Omission is a sad indictment to racism within a religious institution, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it is. And I didn't want to be church bashing in any way, but I had done a lot of research before on the Anglican Church and missions because I wrote a book called Shades, which was in many ways based on my great-grandmother's memoir. And what I found in the letters that I read, and I read hundreds and hundreds of letters, was a very big contrast between those who had come in as with a deep vocation, and also had come in with a will to understand the people that they were ministering to, as well as to be able to embrace something of the culture without being hugely prejudiced. But there were others who, of course, wanted to impose in every way on the people to whom they were ministering. And I would find very bigoted, very dismissive letters, and I would find very wonderful letters as well. But most importantly, what I followed was the journey of Stephen Mnyakama, who was the real man that I based the story on, and his journey as a small boy taken over by the mission stations to school, to be educated, which he was in the classics and like any other colonial schoolboy, and then sent to England. And in reading the background to that, both from the missionary colleges side about their Black students and from his side and the side of other people who had been educated there, they were treated with great equality there, if some sort of astonishment and something rather exotic and different. But when he came back, he was treated by colonial society and within the church as well, still as other Black people were treated, which means that there was an enormous amount of prejudice. And he had his foot between two worlds of wanting to pursue his vocation, but not being given the kind of support that was necessary, and also meeting all the time with the prejudice that was, inherent in the society at the time.
Yeah, and he's fighting his traditional heritage versus his Anglican ministering. Must have been incredibly difficult, and I should imagine it still is to a degree.
Well, I have had reaction from people within the church who have said, sadly, that prejudices still exist, differences still exist, and of course the church has done a great deal to overcome that, but it's another area that obviously needs work. For me, I went back recently to Stephen's church, where the story is set. And in fact, that little church was built by my great-great-grandfather, from whom he took over. I mean, it's a story behind the story. I didn't write about my great-great-grandfather in A Sin of Omission. I had already written about him in Shades. But I went back and found the little parsonage where my great-great-grandfather had built, and where my great-grandmother, after whom I'm named, was born, and the little church that he built as well, and that Stephen took over from him, and where the whole story takes place. And that community is still very vibrant, very alive. And I had the most wonderful experience of going there with one of the tapestries from the Kaiskama Art Project, which illustrated, took on an illustration of my story, and took it to them and to show them. And the interconnections between the people, the long legacy, if you like, of generations within that community that are tied still to my great-great-grandfather, not that people knew about it, but it's been revived as something that that is shared in the history of the place, and that has been just enormously moving and gratifying for me, and somehow made it feel all right for me to write the book, because I was extremely aware and felt very responsible when I was writing A Sin of Omission, not to be accused of appropriation, because after all, I was not writing about my own culture, my own gender, or my own time, and that was a responsibility, a huge responsibility.
It's very difficult in this day and age that we live in, that with this cultural appropriation thing. I mean, men have written about women for hundreds of years, you know,
Yes.
and assuming that's how women feel, and now we actually have to apologize and justify why we choose to write, you know, about, well, I'm a white Jewish woman and I want to write about an Afrikaans Black man growing up in the Karoo. You know, it's quite sad actually that you have to be aware of that as well.
But every novelist has to do that, because obviously I would be writing otherwise books about an old trout living in a retirement complex, digging in the garden. It might not be very exciting.
That's a trout out of water, just by the way. I call my mother an old trout.
I can see her sitting right there beside you.
This book has been very well. It's not an easy book to read, I have to tell you.
No.
There were a couple of times I put it down. I thought, I can't deal with this outright prejudice. I mean, it couldn't have been very easy to write either.
Well, it was incredibly difficult on many fronts, but you know, it wasn't. I didn't have my own table to thump, because the story was actually there within the letters. The conversations between characters, the things that are written between people in their letters, come directly from the record. So, and that was primary source. I mean, they're handwritten letters. And so in a way, it wasn't that difficult, but I had to imagine, I mean, I had to make my cast of characters as well. And there were some who were obviously fictitious. And in another way, I suppose, I looked at Stephen and realized my omissions as a South African in writing about Albert, his friend, who had been his student friend at Canterbury and had come out to South Africa, and who had been sucked into the colonial mindset, especially by his wife, who, I must tell you, I had great fun writing about. In fact, my editor said to me, "Will you please stop her nattering on?" And I had to cut out my favorite pieces. Yes. I was very, very sad about that, but they were my darlings and they had to be killed. And so I also, there were incidents within the story as well, which didn't happen at exactly the same time or to Stephen himself, but there were very, very clear incidents within that time frame that exposed the prejudice and that spoke volumes about what it was like to be a young man like Stephen. I think one of the important, sorry, shall I carry on, or do you want to ask a question?
No, please, carry on.
One of the important incidents that happened during the writing of the book, which was really seminal to how I created it, was that when we were in England, we went to Canterbury itself and went into this little crypt chapel, which is very much part of the story and where the story ends, where the names of the clergy who have been sent all around the world and who had died when they, you know, during the course of their duties were written, were actually carved on the walls of this crypt chapel. And above was put the name of their diocese. And right near the floor was the name of Stephen Nyakama. And it was just an amazing moment, because there was this extremely African name from the Eastern Cape, and there we were standing in a chapel in Canterbury with the great cathedral literally just outside the door. The juxtaposition of the two worlds was, and thinking of it over 100 years ago, was just extraordinary. And then we went to an exhibition of it was called African Victorians. It's now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, but it was in a very small gallery in the East End of London, and it was quite difficult to find, but it was a wonderful exhibition of photographs, and photographs that had been taken of what was called the Zulu choir, which had gone to England, in fact, later than Stephen was in England himself. And it was these portraits of these singers, many of whom I had already read about in the course of my research for Stephen and for the St. Andrews book. And there was this one face that looked out that was so beautiful and so riveting that somehow she had to be in the story and had to be the way to explain the incredible difficulty that Stephen culturally had between being a Xhosa man and being an Anglican priest. And upstairs, there was another little exhibition, and it was of old Victorian albums with those small contact prints and the carte de visite, you know, your visiting card with your picture on it. And we looked at these, Martin was with me, and we looked at these pictures. And I came across one of a young man standing with the sort of inevitable photographer's drape behind him, and a picture of an urn and the sea in the background, and his hat and his cane and his hand on the chair. And it said, underneath it was the name of the photographer, Canterbury, 1868. And I just, I mean, it may not have been, but I just knew that was Stephen. And so the experience of being in that gallery with these two portraits, although taken at a slightly different time, just came together for the novelist as the important emotional kernel of the book.
And that
so
picture
those
runs right through the novel as well.
Yeah, but those experiences have really underpinned the writing, which almost made me feel that that it was okay for me to write the book. I think I need to tell you about one other incident where I was in Corey Library doing the research, and I knew that the real Stephen had been at St. Matthew's mission, where my great-great-grandfather was a priest. And I was in Corey and I had to sign out a book. And when you sign the register, you see all the people before you. And somebody before me had signed out the St. Matthew's baptismal register. And I asked for it, and it was brought to me. And I went to the 1870s. And there were the names of children who'd been baptized and their parents and their godparents. And the priest that baptized them was my great-great-grandfather. And the priest that assisted him was Stephen. Now, I cannot believe that something so incredibly coincidental simply happens. Yeah. And there I knew again that very specific link between my family and his family, although I knew that he'd gone to Grandpa's mission. But it all came back to the story that my great uncle had told me when I was 14. And he told me about a child who'd been sent to be educated, and that he had wanted to be a priest, and that the terrible prejudice against him had led him to the end, that, you know, to what happened to him in the end. And I didn't really understand the story. I didn't really understand then the depth of prejudice or what the whole thing meant. But one thing I do remember is my great uncle said to me, he said, "You must learn to speak an African language." I'm talking about the 60s, so this is high apartheid, and you know, yeah. He said, "You must learn to speak an African language." He said, "If you don't do that, you cannot be a real South African." and that moment, that's why I've said in the acknowledgements of the book, Bau und die Kombis in Lela, you showed me the way. And in a way, you know, that was when the seed of the story was planted, and it took all those years to come to fruition.
This book has been so well received that you've actually been shortlisted for an award.
I was shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize, which was a huge honor. It was wonderful. And the saddest thing is that, you know, because of lockdown, it would have meant going to Scotland to the Melrose Book Fair. There were 6 of us on the shortlist. Obviously, most of the writers came from England, but one was from Syria, and I was the only South African. And it didn't win, which I certainly didn't expect it to, but it was really a huge honor to be shortlisted. And I think also because I knew that the book had a lot of course in it, difficult. It's in a setting that is not familiar to a lot of people. And, you know, I just was overwhelmed with delight when I was told it was on the shortlist.
But it's not your first time to be awarded a prize for a book. I mean, you are very, very, you know, well known and very honored to have received many awards for your writing throughout your career.
Yes, I have been very lucky, and they're all hugely appreciated. I can remember the very first time that I was phoned to say I'd won the Fitzpatrick Award for The Mantis and the Moon. I really didn't believe the man who was talking to me. And that was the first. I thought it was one of our friends having a joke, but that was wonderful. And all of them have been just hugely and deeply appreciated. And I also have to tell you, I was made an honorary old boy of St. Andrews, which I think was probably a breakthrough, second to none. So I'm allowed to wear the school badge if I want to.
Did you get school colours at least?
Yes.
Can I have a show of hands who's actually read A Sin of Omission? Marilyn, I know you have.
What about Jen?
Jen, have you read it? Eleanor? Oh, everybody else has got their screens off, so I don't know. Eleanor, have you read it?
I'm still trying to find it, Mandy. Sorry, so I haven't been able to find it. No.
Right here on my table.
Yay!
It's available on Amazon as well if you want to read it. But you like to hold the book in your hand, don't you?
This is the one that most people know.
Yes.
Because it was a set work for matric for a long time.
Oh, this should be actually a set work for matric. Has there been any interest in schools for it?
Not that I know of yet, but I must. Shades was set work for a long time, which was great. The only thing is that set works are not terribly popular. I remember a chap that said that he had put a set work in a tree. He was a farmer's son and got his tutor and shot Lizzie Bennet between the eyes. It was Pride and Prejudice. So I hope that hasn't been the fate of my book Shades.
You know, that's because they rip books apart. I remember, I mean, I hated English at school. I really did. I was terrible at it. And I remember like doing poetry and the teacher would say, well, you know, the blue curtains. And I'm like, well, how do you know he's referring to his mood? And well, maybe the curtains were actually blue. I could never, I mean, I would fall asleep during Shakespeare. English was completely wasted on me at school. I mean, maybe it's because I'm going to blame the teachers here because the teachers were terrible.
It's also the way people interpret things. I wrote a poem called The Hawk, which got published. I was at school still in Personality magazine. I'm far too old for any of you to have remembered Personality. But when I was at Rose, one of my friends took it to a poetry workshop thing. I didn't want to go. And they thought it was some kind of hidden message about Marxism. And meanwhile, all it was a poem about a hawk. But I was terribly pleased by that analysis at that particular point.
You're not actually a secret commie, are you?
I suppose we all were when we were 18 at university in the 60s, but
Marguerite, there's a theme that seems to run through your books, and it seems to be that they're all very personal to you. It's not like you like Lee Child churning out, Jack Reacher fiction. You actually have a vested interest in every one of the books that you've produced.
Yes, I have.
Word, an emotional connection. Let me say that instead.
Yeah, I do. And I suppose I've been lucky in that I could write what I really wanted to write. My children's stories came out of having lived on in a small holding in the bush and knowing about small animals. And the fact that I always felt that we were educated on English children's books, my generation particularly. And I wanted to write something that really meant something to me, that I had observed and that I knew. So that's where it started. And yes, every single book has had a personal connection. Shades was very much based on my great-grandmother's memoir, or it's sparked by that. Iron Love by a photograph album that was sent, that was my grandfather's cousin, young chap killed at 19 in the First World War, which led on to this sort of connection to be going back to Grahamstown, and then finding the story that I'd heard when I was 14 and coming across something when I was doing research for the Anglican institution, which was part of St. Andrews, and finding a moment where I knew that the person that I was reading about was that same young man I'd heard about when I was 14. So there have always been those moments of real sense of belonging to that particular story.
The connection.
And yeah, otherwise I don't think I would be a writer. It had to mean something personal, spend all those years doing it as well. So there is a connection with everything.
And your characters, do they live in your head? Do they speak to you?
Yes, I always remember one of my daughters saying when she was about 10, "Who are you talking to? Why aren't you talking to me?" And I think that probably it was quite a difficult thing for my children, because I was always in the 19th century, and I was always, in a sense, I suppose, preoccupied. I was a very present mother in physically, but perhaps I was sometimes fairly absent in my head. But all my family have been tremendously supportive, so I'm very lucky. And my mother was an artist, and she from the very beginning, and I think this is so important for children, she really gave me the place and the encouragement and the affirmation to write. And yeah, so much of my work is a tribute to her and to my grandmother.
So what's next for Marguerite Poland?
Well, I kind of got burnt out after the last book, but at the moment, although it's very early days, I'm working with the Keiskammer Art Project. I don't know if any of you know of the art. I'm sure you do, Mandi. You know their work in their wonderful cattle tapestry in Parliament.
Yes, I do know that the particular piece of work, funny enough. And then I actually want to, after my sister-in-law said to me the other day, why don't I get hold of Carol and ask her to actually come and do a talk with us?
Oh, and I think you should do that.
Idea. So I'm going to email her. I saw that her email address is actually in the literature that I got. And I am going to email her and ask her to talk us through it and show us some pictures.
Well, she has now retired because they've gone to Botswana. And there is also a young woman called Michaela House who worked as a curator in Cape Town and had to do with those wonderful beaded sculptures of Nguni cattle. I don't know if you remember them. They were quite superb. She ran an NGO that worked with that. And she's now running the project as in Carol's place. And in fact, Carol met her at my book launch. She had known her before, but they met up again. And that was the moment when she found a successor for herself at Kaskama. But Carol was still there last year. I have been connected with Carol for a long time. When they were doing the Xhosa tapestry, because I had just done the book on the cattle color patterns, they wanted to have ideas about how to do the cattle, you know, what the color patterns meant. And she used my work to see the different, you know, different ways to represent them. And when that was launched, it was launched in Grahamstown at the Arts Festival, and I was there. And so that was when we first got to know each other, when I was helping with the cattle on that wonderful tapestry. And then I went back to Kaskama, and they did a series of tapestries called Insingizi tapestries, which I don't know if you remember, which were all to do with Xhosa bird law. And I had quite a lot of input with that. And those, again, were wonderful tapestries. And because we know each other well, and because we've written to each other and kept in contact, she knew about the Sin of Omission, and I'd seen her in Hamburg. And she said she would like to illustrate some of the scenes. And so they did these 4 magnificent tapestries of Stephen at the missionary college in Canterbury, and Stephen arriving at the mission, and then a picture of Stephen at the contemporary mission with people that are there now. So it has sort of become a full circle thing, and also Stephen being found during the great cattle killing as a starving little boy. And these tapestries are absolutely magnificent. Some of them are, in fact, still available. And so that has been a new connection with them. And now they are hoping to make a very big tapestry to commemorate this terrible pandemic that we're in at the moment, and the experience of the community at Hamburg of this, you know, of what COVID-19 is doing within their community as well. And so I have been working on some images with them, or what I've done is done some small poems to spark reaction, and perhaps out of course cosmology as well. You know, there are wonderful words for plague, not wonderful words, terrible sort of images which talk about plague. For example, I don't know, you might have remembered in the Sin of Omission, there's a word called, which is isimema, which means the howling of dogs, which means a great grief. It's something when a catastrophe happens. There's another word, itobichaiti, which was given to the Rinderpest, meaning the pride breaker. And there are so many images within the language which somehow speak of loss and grief and catastrophe. And so the artists obviously their own images, their own experience, all of that. But I've just been very interested and hoping to support in some way that initiative for that tapestry to be made, because this moment in our history obviously will be commemorated in words, but needs to be commemorated visually as well. Kaskama once did a huge tapestry, which was the African Guernica, based on Picasso's Guernica, which was about the AIDS pandemic, which was incredibly moving and hugely well received, as well as making an enormous impact. And you know, that's what Kaskama Art Project's work has done. And their embroiderers are extraordinary people with immense talent that Carol and the administration of the art project are able to foster and to invigorate, which they do.
Yeah, and they do that so beautifully. So yeah, so I'm definitely going to get in touch, because I loved the idea and I thought it would be fantastic. And it's particularly also as a follow-up to this talk with you, it would also be wonderful to see images of those tapestries and to find out, the stories behind them. It's quite interesting that you mentioned the pandemic and the art that's coming up as a result, because I did a piece, in fact, it's sitting on the table next to me, it's not finished, a sculpture for COVID. And yesterday, a friend of mine posted a message about a woman that's got I think it's called a million masks, and they're looking for COVID art. And this is one of the pieces that I'm going to submit when it's finished. It kind of celebrates the earth and the renewal of the earth during this time. So,
oh well, Mandi, do get hold of Carol on that, because apparently they are hugely busy with this, as well as the fact that in doing it, it will support a community or help to support a community where at a time when, art obviously is not being bought a lot of at the moment. The whole economy is in huge distress, and people in a community like that, which is really hand-to-mouth living, just need that encouragement and that forum as well. So that would be just wonderful.
Definitely, I will do that. It's been absolutely delightful chatting to you this morning, Marguerite, and I really wanted to thank you. I just want to read you a couple of bit of feedback that's over here. I live in Wackerstroom, so lots of beautiful Nguni cattle here. I got your stunning book recently and I love it. The cattle owners are fascinated with it. From Gilda, by far one of the best people I've ever met, and what a lady and inspiring person. Eleanor, thank you for a wonderful and interesting talk. You're an incredibly inspiring person. So yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You speak so beautifully. I've had to slow down the way I speak and try and speak a little bit better this morning. I can see my mother's, I've got my voice on this morning so that I'm speaking a little bit better, not in my usual.
I've probably got my teacher voice on. But it's been so lovely to be with you, and thank you, Marilyn, and thank you, Jen, and thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Gilda, and thank you, Mandi's mum. It's just been wonderful to be part of in the garden.
Thank you so much.
And I'm going to go into my garden now and look at my plants, and my garden's full of mantises, which is very good luck.
Oh, fantastic. Maybe they'll try and capture the moon. Thank you, Marguerite. Have a lovely day. Thank you, everybody.
And you too, and everybody else. Bye-bye. Keep well.
Bye, everyone.
Keep safe.
Bye.
Bye.